We talk about intelligence all the time, at school, at work, in tests, in everyday conversations. We love putting people into categories. Brilliant, average, struggling, as if one single measure could summarize the full complexity of a human brain. But the moment we start looking at people with very low IQ, an uncomfortable question appears. Are we really talking about a lack of intelligence, or about a completely different way of living, understanding, and reacting to the world? Because that is where the subject becomes much deeper than most people imagine. An extremely low IQ does not mean there is nothing there. It does not mean a total absence of thought, emotion, or coherence. What it mostly describes is a very limited cognitive functioning in certain specific areas. Abstract reasoning, anticipation, complex problem-solving, and processing speed. In other words, things that many people do almost automatically can require far more effort here, and sometimes may never develop in quite the same way at all. Understanding a distant consequence, following several mental steps at once, adapting to unspoken rules, quickly decoding a new situation. All of that can become extremely difficult. The brain does not process information with the same fluidity. It relies much more on the concrete, the visible, the familiar, and the repetitive. And that is exactly what many people misunderstand. When we hear very low IQ, we often imagine emptiness, when in reality there is still an inner world. It is just not organized around abstraction. It is much more rooted in the present moment, in sensation, in habits, in direct emotions, in what is lived here and now. And within that framework, there can be a real form of coherence. Many people with very limited cognitive functioning learn through repetition, through routine, through imitation, through emotional safety. What is stable, predictable, and familiar becomes essential. Because when the world is too complex, too fast, or too abstract, it also becomes much more exhausting, stressful, and sometimes impossible to understand. But that does not mean there is no human connection, and that is probably one of the most important things to understand. Low intellectual abilities do not necessarily erase emotional sensitivity. A person may have enormous difficulty reasoning abstractly, and still feel warmth, gentleness, fear, attachment, tension in a voice, or safety in someone's presence very intensely. They may not understand a complicated concept, but they can quickly recognize whether someone is gentle, impatient, reassuring, or threatening. And that completely changes the way we should look at intelligence. Because in the end, what does an IQ test really measure? It mainly measures a few very specific mental performances: logic, working memory, reasoning, cognitive speed. But it does not measure a person's full human value. It does not measure the love they can give. It does not measure their need for attachment. It does not measure their ability to sense an atmosphere, respond to a gentle voice, or build a sincere bond with someone who treats them with respect. And that is where our ideas about intelligence begin to crack. Because if a person can be very limited on the cognitive level, while still having a real emotional life, a strong affective presence, and a capacity to learn through experience, then maybe intelligence is not what we thought it was. Maybe we simply took one part of human functioning and treated it as if it were the whole. In reality, the human brain is far bigger than that. It does not exist only to solve problems or manipulate abstract ideas. It also exists to attach, to feel, to recognize familiar cues, to respond to safety, and to build a world that makes sense at its own scale. And maybe that is the most unsettling point of all. The things we most instinctively associate with being human, loving, fearing, seeking comfort, feeling another person's presence, forming attachment, do not depend only on high intellectual ability. Those things live deeper, in layers of the brain that tests barely reach. So, understanding the psychology of an extremely low IQ is not just about talking about limitation. It is also about questioning our definition of intelligence, and remembering that a brain can be very restricted in some areas without being empty. It can be different, fragile sometimes, dependent often, but still deeply human.